Thank you for joining us today for this special episode on mental health, the church, and overcoming trauma. Today, we have two special guests, Sherry Pomeroy. She's Pastor Frank Pomeroy's wife of Sutherland Springs, Texas First Baptist Church. And then Dr. Chris Clancy, a longtime FBSN member. She is a licensed psychologist who has been working in the area of crisis intervention for nearly 30 years. She has worked and trained alongside first responders with the FBSN and many other organizations in the area of stress and trauma. She provides training and education on mental health incidents in secular and faith-based settings. And she's actually doing a session and a pre-event intensive at this year's Security Operations Summit on mental health in the church. So glad to have you both joining us today. This is a very important message for church security teams to understand. We're not only going to dive into some of the preventative measures we can take to protect houses of worship, but we're going to focus on the long-term effects of trauma and how to be prepared for that as well. Carl Chin, the founder of the FBSN, often emphasizes to teams that we are first and foremost ambassadors of Christ as a security team. So with that in mind, let's break down the details and get some behind-the-scenes insight into the reality of an incident that all of you watching this are probably training for, but praying that it would never happen at your church. On Sunday morning, November 5th, 2017, a killer opened fire on the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. He fired over 200 rounds into the church before entering and continuing the shooting. In this act of horrific violence, 26 parishioners were murdered that day. Not one of the 49 parishioners in the church that morning was untouched by some sort of physical trauma. Only 4 of the 23 that were wounded did not have an overnight stay at the hospital. Sherry, it has been over 8 years now. The first time I met you was in Houston, Texas. That was in 2021. That would have been about 4 years after the incident. I heard you also spoke at an SOS that I wasn't at earlier. It was only a year after the attack. I remember it was such a powerful message of hope that you and Frank gave. I don't know how you were able to do it, but can you tell us a little bit about that so quickly after the incident and then what it is like today?
The speaking, a lot of that speaking during the first year or so, a lot of that came from muscle memory. You said you don't know how we did it. It was all God, because there's a lot of those things that we don't even remember that happened in the first year or two from trauma brain. And they have told us, we were kind of worried about our mental health, and when we learned that it actually had a name and we weren't actually going forgetting stuff just for no reason, we were kind of relieved about that. So
I bet the message that you gave then is different than the message that you share today. A lot of times you've opened up a lot more about your journey and your struggle with anger and mental health.
I did have a lot of anger, and I relied totally on muscle memory. I knew all of the words to say, but I was speaking mostly from my brain, not from my heart. And I have since learned to share my story because my story is important, and we don't know who it will help. And I've learned to be more obedient to God in sharing my story as I have found my voice through different venues that I'm sure we'll get into in a few minutes. And I have, as I have been on this healing journey, I have learned to share my story, and I have learned that it is okay to grieve differently, and that everybody grieves at a different time. Everybody grieves at a different level. There is no quantifying grief. You know, if you have lost if you have had grief, it doesn't even have to be a loss. If you have experienced grief, grief is grief, and there is no quantifying grief.
You've talked about sharing your story, and that's actually a big factor that has influenced your healing. You have a story about anger and somebody that became a friend to you that shared what God put on her heart, and it also helped you with that healing. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, that was very early on after the tragedy, probably about 2 weeks. I was still very angry with God. And it was my first trip to the hospital to meet with our survivors. And we were being driven everywhere by somebody. So I was in the back seat of a vehicle, and this woman I had never met before climbed in beside me. And I was I was apprehensive about going to the hospital, but I was also still dealing with a lot of anger. Now I was going to these people to encourage them, full of anger.
Mm.
So that irony in itself, also relies on that muscle memory. I knew what to say, but I sure wasn't feeling it in my heart yet. So this lady climbs in the back seat of the car and she says, Sherry, I know we don't know each other, but God told me I have to tell you this story. And immediately my walls went up. For one, that should have been my friends there, Lou and Carla, that died in the shooting. And here comes this lady that I don't even know talking to me about my God that had just upended my life. My faith was tested a lot. I had anger issues. I had questions. Why? But so this, I didn't want to hear anything from God right then. And that's a side note. You have to be obedient to God to tell your story when the time is appropriate. And this was very appropriate, even though I didn't know it. But sometimes you want to say, God will make it all better, when that's not what they need to hear. They need to hear your silence. They need to hear your compassion, maybe with no words at all. But that's just a side note. Let me get back to my story. So this lady gets in the car. She said, I have to tell you the story, and I don't know why. God told me I have to tell you this. So I'm rolling my eyes in my head, thinking I'm not going to listen to anything God has to tell me right now. But she goes on to tell me her story. She says, when I was about 9 years old, my family and I went on a trip to the Texas coast, and we were all swimming out in the ocean, and my dad got caught up in a riptide. And it was terrifying for us all. We all got to safety, but he got caught up in that riptide, and we thought he had died. Well, the survivors, I mean, the workers finally got him up to shore. He was convulsing. He was in obvious pain. He was gray. He was just. We thought he was dead, and he started throwing up. And he got well. He was okay with that, and they took him in and everything. And I was talking to my dad years later after that, and I told him what I saw. And he was so surprised. And he said, Christy, I didn't experience any of that. The only thing I felt was God's peace over me. And she said, that's the end of my story. I don't know why I had to tell you that, but that's it. So by now, my eyes had quit rolling and they had started producing tears down my cheek. And I said, the reason you had to tell me this story is because this mama's heart has been grieving and asking, what happened to my Annabelle in the last few minutes? And by Christy sharing that story, she had no idea why. God spoke to me even through my anger. When we're angry, that doesn't change who God is. Even through my anger, God spoke to me and said, that's the way Annabelle was. No matter what anyone else saw, this story from Christy's dad is the way Annabelle was taken care of. God had his hand over her, and shielded her from anything, just like Christy's dad didn't feel the pain or the sadness, the scaredness, anything else. Annabelle was covered by God's hand, and that was my first glimmer of hope after the tragedy, that Annabelle didn't suffer those 11 minutes, or some say 17 minutes, because she was covered by the mercy of God's hand.
What a powerful message. And thank God that she had the courage to share it with you, the obedience to share it with you.
Yes, absolutely.
I Hearing you talk, hearing you share what you've gone through, hearing her share that story reminds me of a verse that meant so much that came in a song after the shooting at our church, New Life Church there in Colorado Springs. It's Revelation 12:11. And they have conquered him, meaning Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So the word of
Amen.
our testimony. So what are some common long-term trauma effects years afterward?
Okay. That's a great question, because this can come about in a couple different ways. One, these could be experiences that people have had ever since the trauma, or they could be things that come on suddenly. The effects of trauma can occur anywhere in a timeline. They could be immediate or they could be delayed. So it's important to recognize that, and that's a great question. We can have any kind of emotional symptoms that somebody might experience. They're having depression, symptoms of anxiety, that, and they don't know where they're coming from. So it's very often, especially if it's delayed, to just attribute it to some other mental health issue and not possibly recognize that it might be related to that trauma. Irritability is a big one. Emotional reactivity, reacting in a way that's out of proportion to something that might happen. And you say, Sherry, that might have been some of what you're going through. That it's and you think, wow, that did not warrant that kind of reaction. Why did I react that way? Or maybe someone else did. Feelings of safety can occur sometimes after there has been a trauma in the past. At any time, it makes us question our feelings of safety in different situations. Mistrust of others is something that can happen. Being suspicious, being jaded, cynical toward others. And that can relate also to something that can happen, an altered worldview. When there has been horrific trauma, some of the things that we've talked about, questioning, and Sherry, you even mentioned at that time, and it's something that can happen down the road, questioning goodness, evil, questioning God, questioning faith, questioning vulnerability on a large scale. For instance, when the 9/11 incident happened and the Twin Towers went down, a lot of people questioned their safety in their world in general. Something that can also come about is an idea of justice, that justice must occur. And that comes along kind of with that altered worldview. That's where you get a lot of road rage, actually. The idea of a wrong was done in some way, there must be a response. I must respond. And that can kind of come along sometimes with the anger that gets displayed. And we have a lot of people in our church safety teams who served in the military, who served in law enforcement or are still serving. And that's something that I've heard a lot from those folks, that altered worldview. And you see it sometimes in folks, the idea that there must be a response. So that's something that that a lot of people, I think, are not aware of. They might be more aware of the emotional more emotional symptoms that can come up, but other things like that that affect our perception of the world, our worldview in general.
And I think we inadvertently hit that head on early on at the first press conference. Our response was Frank's response was, I don't know why this happened, but my God does, and he will get us through. And that was something that he carried through the church, through the community, and ultimately through the country. Was our response of hope instead of our response of hate. And we purposely chose hope. And he just said that God gave him those words, of course, but we didn't know the technical terms that you have just explained to us. And looking back at that, that's exactly what happened. That was our first response was hope, and we didn't let go of that hope.
You talked about that message of hope and the message that you guys gave afterwards being just so much built on muscle memory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a concept that security volunteers can understand in training. When the incident happens, that training will kick in and muscle memory can carry you to do what has to be done. This is just as important. Really, it's more important applied to your spiritual life. The training you have had spiritually can carry you when everything else feels totally out of control. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to dive into a little bit more. You touched on how grief looks differently, Sherry. You and Frank grieved differently. What did that look like?
Uh, it looked like a lot of pain. It looked like uh, a train wreck. It looked like a marriage falling apart. It looked like a lot of bad things. When we finally got the tools that we needed to understand grief, to learn how to start healing, um, all of those things together helped us. I may be jumping the gun here, but it took me medication, it took me group therapy, it took me personal one-on-one therapy, it took a lot of prayers and things like that. But I finally found my voice at a retreat. Actually, I was prophesied over by one of the pastors there, and she said, "You will find your voice." And so that's been kind of my slogan, because she helped me overcome that fear of of having I was afraid to have my own voice, because in 15 years of ministry, Frank and I have always sat side by side and together. We have never had anything, so dramatically different about us. We've been a team. So when we got to grieving, I was stunned that it was so different, and to I was afraid to grieve, I guess, because I was afraid I was doing it wrong. What is grief? What do I do? What do I need to do to heal? And we were focusing so much on each other and other people that we needed to learn how to do it on our own each. And I grieve very openly. I'm very active on my Facebook page. Now, not so much, but in the first few years, I talked very openly about my walk with God and how the anger is okay, and however you deal with it is okay. So I don't have the background that Dr. Chris has. I don't have all of that. All I have is my own story. And I decided to share that story in case somebody else needed it, just like I needed Christy's story. And Frank, on the other hand, he was very private, still is very private, but I was angry at him at the same time as grieving all of this. Was another component to grief, but I was angry at him for not grieving like I was. And I didn't know I was angry at him for that. I was just angry all the time. But through my counseling and therapy and all of that, I was able to learn that that's where that stemmed from. And we had to learn that to give each other some space and not expect one to be like the other. And it's okay. What I had to learn mostly was it's okay to be different. It's okay um, to find my voice and grieve like I need to grieve because we're made different.
Yeah, you might have answered this, but at what point did you learn that different didn't mean wrong? Was that when you were sharing your story? What was that turning point for you when you realized it was not wrong to grieve differently?
There were many, many turning points, and grief is not a straight line. It's just a zigzag. One of the points where I learned that it was okay was at that retreat I talked about, that it was okay to grieve because it was a group retreat. And I heard all of these other people that were grieving. And I realized not everybody is just like Frank. I don't have to be like him because at first, one of the things that he did that I felt shut down in was he did not want to talk to any media about anything. I, on the other hand, wanted to talk about it so they would spell my daughter's name right. So they would get her age right. So she would be remembered right. And they're going to report, my feelings was they're going to report on this. I might as well give them the right information instead of having them make it up and get it wrong. And so we butted heads a lot about that. And we had to think about the face of the church because we were the face of the church. So I didn't want us to be seen as, differing like that. So you had that put a lot into it of having to, when you're a pastor, you live in a fishbowl. So you're always, being scrutinized. So you have to keep that in the back of your head. And that was one thing I really overcame about then was I'm not playing that game anymore. I'm going to be, and I was just more quiet before. And when I found my voice under prayer, uh, I felt comfortable to speak. Now, I still had to quiet my voice when I was speaking out of my mouth instead of God's heart, lots and lots of times. But when you find your voice, something inside you just heals for me.
Chris, this is for you. Why do families sometimes grieve so differently? People in the same family.
Yeah. Well, Sherry did such a tremendous job of talking about what was going on in her own life, in her husband's life. We are all unique individuals, and we have different histories. And for instance, a husband and wife, they have a different family background. How was grieving done? What were the responses to losses when they were children, when they were growing up? Are there cultural factors from ethnic or cultural backgrounds to start with? Gender, we're socialized still very often that it's all right for women to be more expressive. It's not all right for men to be more expressive. Our own personalities, we have different personalities. Some of us are more open, and Sherry talking about I grieved more openly. Some of us are more solitary grievers. It is a private experience for us, and those are both okay. Something else that I have learned in my own life is that the significance or the meaning of that person that we lost, it's different to each one of us, and that impacts our grief. That personal significance can impact the guilt that we might feel, the sense of responsibility that we might feel related to that person's death. And that can have a tremendous impact on what we're going through, because it is very common, and you've mentioned some of these, Sherry, for people to experience guilt, anger, things like that. Those shoulda, coulda, wouldas. Was someone ill in the hospital? Is there something I could have done, should have done? And you might have, let's say, children in a family might feel very differently about those issues. And it might impact the way they express their grief, the length of time that it impacts them, the extent of that grief on their day-to-day lives. So all of those sorts of things can play in, but we don't necessarily think about a lot of those. That very, very individual element can have a big impact as well. And also, are you doing the work? They talk about, there's the expression, time heals all wounds. Time is a factor. And boy, Sherry, do you know this? Time will not fix things. It will not heal anything. You have to do the work or you get stuck. And there's no way to accelerate the grief process, no way to microwave, fast forward it, but we can slow it down and get stuck if we don't do the work.
With all of those factors in mind, it seems like it'd be more of the outlier for family members to grieve the same way with that many factors played into this. So I think to expect the grief to look different is good. And Sherry, you've talked about your whole family a little bit, how you guys worked through that. And one of your daughters has actually written a paper about this. Do you want to share anything about that? That sounds very interesting from her perspective.
Well, she is an English professor, and it's undergoing publication right now. So I don't have it in front of me to read from, so I don't want to misquote anything. But that is how she healed from her grief. Also, was writing. A part of that healing, and she wrote a real powerful piece that will be available soon.
Awesome. I look forward to reading that too. So for security teams, this is really important to think about how a crisis at your ministry that you respond to will affect your family. Understanding that grief will look different, that their grief will look different than yours, and to be ready to balance your personal grief while supporting your family. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is removing shame from mental health care and the church. So Sherry, I'm going to move this one back to you, talking about what finally helped you turn a corner in your healing. And I've heard, sharing your story and those things. Is there anything else? I'm sure there's a ton of factors, but what are some of the other factors that helped you turn a corner?
Yes, there were so many. I remember one corner I turned. I was very suicidal. At one point, I didn't get out of bed. I didn't eat. I didn't do anything. And I didn't know this at the time that I was that bad. I just knew I, um, didn't want to live, and I didn't know anybody else knew my thoughts and but my actions showed that, until Frank spoke at one of y'all's events and said that he didn't know what to do with me. So he called my sister, and instead of talking to me, all she did was crawl in bed beside me. And that's what gave me the power to get up at that time. That was just one incident. Another incident was about a few years later, probably in 20, well, I don't even want to say the year, but anyways, I was driving over a bridge and I heard the news about the court case that we weren't a part of it, but I heard the news come over the radio, and it said that the judge had ruled that the Air Force was 60% liable for the deaths in Sutherland Springs. And that just hit me like a brick. And I had a panic attack. I was driving, and to hear that somebody was responsible for something else was responsible for my daughter's death, and they were saying it could have been prevented, if possibly could have been prevented if these steps had been taken. And that just sent me into a panic attack. And I knew I was getting better because I prayed, God, just get me over this bridge and I'll almost be home. Whereas before, in my darkest days, I would have said, and I did say at some point, I could just drive right off of this bridge. No one would ever know it wasn't an accident. And when I prayed, God, just get me over this bridge, I'm almost home, I knew that that was a turning point for me wanting to live again. And that was several years later.
Chris, why is trauma sometimes mistaken for a spiritual failure in church settings?
That's a really meaningful question. Immediately we go to, well, obviously you didn't have enough faith. Where it can get extra tricky is the question that you asked previously about some of the things that can show up down the road. And I forgot to mention a couple of things that I meant to, and I'll mention them now. Things like suicidal thoughts, intrusive thoughts of the event, flashbacks, sleep disturbance, things like that. They can surface down the road. The idea is as a Christian, you're going through your spiritual journey over time. And it would be understandable if you're experiencing those things right off the bat after the trauma happens. And they can. But it gets especially tricky down the road. You're maturing spiritually, you're active in your church. And then you're having some difficulties. You're having these experiences. And you might ask yourself, what's wrong with me spiritually? Because I should be able to overcome these things spiritually, especially if you weren't even dealing with them then. But others in the church, loving folks that church folks sometimes are, well, you just need to pray. You just need to work on your faith. Because honestly, it's all they have. I think that how else, does the average church person explain other than you just need to have more faith. You need to spend more time in the Word, things like that. And that is terribly important, but so are other things. And understanding what other things go with that, which I know we'll get into.
Yeah, we call those grief ambushes. They just sneak up on you. And you make a valid point about people not knowing what to say. That's why we try to tell people it's important to discern God's will before you speak, because some of those things that you mean so well are taken so bad. And about the faith, I think as Christians, we shame people about mental health, and that should not be. This is my soapbox, so if I ramble, just let me know. But if you broke your arm or your leg, is your friend going to tell you, oh, just pray about it, it will heal itself? Absolutely not. They're going to take you to the hospital. They're going to get you some medication for pain. You're going to get your leg set. It's going to go in a cast. They're going to use imaging. They're going to use all of these tools that God has given us to use and fix your broken leg. There is no difference in that and your heart being broken and your mind being broken and your soul being torn. Mental health is just as important or more important than your physical health. So for somebody to say, just pray about it, or you don't have enough faith, that's absurd to me. And it's very demeaning, because I have prayed. God chose to say no to me about some things. And for you to say you don't have enough faith, that's just kicking somebody when they're down. And it is the most detrimental thing Christians can do to each other. If you have enough faith, you will get better. God doesn't promise that. God promises that he will be with us. He doesn't promise us that everything will be as we want it. He promises to meet our needs, not always our wants. And we don't have the big picture like God does. Yes, we're devastated when it happens because we're just looking at the back of this beautiful tapestry that he is sewing together on the top. And we don't see the full picture.
That's so good. That it reminds me, we do have a book of the Bible to read on this one. It's Job, and the way his friends didn't really support him in that. His well-meaning friends said a lot of very painful, untrue things through his grief that we do today to our friends.
I can tell you one thing that was meant very, very kind, but it just broke me. One counselor said to me very early on, at least you have more kids. And now, 8 years later, I can see that. Yes, at least my other kids are still here, but that's not something you want to hear right in the beginning, because it depreciates Annabelle's meaning, and it it's not something you have to pray before you speak.
Yeah, and people that have been through trauma like that, those words, we're so sensitive to everything that is said during those times. So, Chris, how do medication and therapy actually support healing at a neurological level?
Well, with the advances in medical technology, we have learned so much about how the brain works. And research has shown with all of this imaging that trauma and grief actually impact the functioning of the brain. Trauma and grief are very unique kinds of stress. And we all have our typical ways of, we know how we respond to stress. Oh, when I get stressed, I fill in the blank. But trauma and grief are very different. And they impact the neural pathways. They impact chemical balance in the brain. And if it is very mild, very often that there are behavioral things that we can put into practice that will be helpful for that. But when it is serious enough, it does knock that stuff out of whack. And so what medication can do, it can help rebalance those neurotransmitters so that our brain can function more normally, and then we can better utilize other tools, and we can function better with both. So the medication is important for some people in some situations. And I am very, very conservative when it comes to the use of medications. Photobomb. I may have a feline before we're done with this process. So I'm very conservative when it comes to that. But I will say there are times when medication is necessary, when what you're experiencing, these symptoms of trauma, the depression, the anxiety, are interfering with your functioning to such an extent. So that's when you talk about it, with your physician or psychiatrist. Therapy comes into play for several reasons, but you asked about neurologically. When we are experiencing those emotions, and we'll take Sherry, when you're experiencing those emotions and you're just feeling those raw emotions, most of that's going on the right side of your brain. But language is located on the left side of the brain. So when we talk about what's going on, we activate that left side of the brain. It becomes more active and it starts carrying some of the load that the right side was carrying. That's why talking about the things we're struggling with is so important. It has a neurological impact. That's terribly important, in addition to learning coping techniques, processing feelings, that sort of thing. So there is a multi-layered benefit in therapy when it comes to that. That's also why it's so important to tell your story. And the idea of tell your story, tell your story, tell your story, tell your story. And probably, Sherry, you have experienced over time the most painful elements that you share, that over time it probably became a little bit easier to share those things. At least it often does. And that's because your brain is leveling out. In addition just to your emotions in general, your brain is also leveling out in some healing from the trauma. So that's why both of those things are very important.
Yes. I have been on several different medications, and when they finally found the right one, I just felt a click. It felt like my brain got a jump start, and I wasn't on them long term. In my case, it that's what I felt it just needed was a jump start. And another therapy that I did was EMDR, was kind of like what you were explaining. They explained it to me in layman's terms as your brain, when you go through grief or trauma, your brain stores it right here, but it's not supposed to be there. So in the therapy they put it when you go through therapy, it allows your brain to put it where it goes in the right spot, and it's not all clumped together, making everything misfire. And that made a lot of sense to me before I started EMDR, and EMDR did work for me. And I'd like to note too that just because one thing doesn't work for you doesn't mean the next thing won't. It like you said, doctor, it's you have to do the work. I like that. You have to do the work. You can't quit because you and your first therapist did not go together. It's like buying a shoe. Some shoes don't fit, some therapists and you don't fit. And it's, you kind of feel, oh, I don't want to hurt their feelings or something. But it's just like a going and trying on shoes that didn't fit. That doesn't mean you don't need shoes. It means you need a different pair. And it took some going through things like that. And if one thing works for me and doesn't work for Frank, that's okay too. So it's good to note that not everything is going to work for you on the same try. You've got to do the work.
This is just so valuable to our security teams. Mental health is overlooked in our planning, and security operators, they just talk about planning, planning, planning. And we said at the beginning of this episode, we're not just planning to stop an attack physically, but we want to carry on as ambassadors of Christ. We want to heal after a crisis. So to have a plan in place for after an incident, to have mental health resources. A lot of churches have working relationships with local counseling offices that they refer congregants to. These are good resources to already have a good working relationship with. And then when we're putting together our plans, don't neglect the immediate aftermath plans. Put together a detailed after action emergency plan. So these should all be paired up with the plans that we make to prevent incidents. And when talking about therapy, medication, and prayer, these are all tools, resources that we have for us. They're not competitors. Sherry, I want to talk to you about this. Not only did you turn to therapy, but let's talk about prayer and your established foundation in Christ that brought you healing.
Okay. Early on, I had a friend of mine, ask, how can you still believe in prayer after all of this happened? And I thought about it luckily it was through text that she asked me that. So I had some time to think about it. But again, I knew the right thing to say. But as I thought about it, prayed about it, this is, what I told her. This is the story I told her that helped me still believe in prayer. One of the victims of our shooting was Carla. She was a good friend to everybody. She was one of my greatest friends. And she would pray for everything. She was just a giant prayer warrior. Frank always says, if you lost your keys, go ask Carla to pray and they will just manifest. She prayed a lot. And one of her biggest prayers, and we now have it documented in one of her prayer journals that her daughter gave us, that this is all documented. So in her own handwriting, it's precious. But what I told my friend that asked, how can you still believe in prayer, was Carla would walk the perimeter of this property that we had behind our little clapboard church. We had 2 acres between us and the main highway, and often it was overgrown with knee-high weeds, but she had walked a path around that 2 acres, and she would do it most of every time she came to church, and she would walk around and pray for that land to become part of the church. Well, we had already looked into it and it was way too expensive for us to buy. We just couldn't afford it. And Frank had told her that, Carla, why do you keep praying for that? We've already decided we can't afford that. And she said, I'm not praying that we can buy that. I'm praying that God will give us this land. And so she walked that trail till a path was worn, just like an animal wears a path in the weeds. And she would often pray and pray and pray. So I told my friend, Debbie, maybe the first 100 times Carla walked around that field, maybe God told her no. And maybe the next 200 times she prayed and walked around that field and asked that God would give it to us, maybe he said, not yet. And both of those things are answer to prayer. We don't like those answers of no and not yet, but they are still answers to prayer. And then on the day of November the 5th, 2017, Carla's car was parked back by the field, which was her habit a lot of times, which meant that she probably got out and prayed, walked around and prayed around that field, as was her habit. And maybe that morning, God said, Carla, are you ready for the yes? And I know without a shadow of doubt, Carla would have said, whatever it takes, God, I'm ready, whatever it takes. And that piece of land was actually given to our church without one penny being spent from the church coffers. And that's how I can still believe in prayer, because I know my friend Carla believed in prayer till the very end. And I want to be more like Carla.
That's incredible. That's just an incredible testimony of her life and her heart. So, Chris, can you talk to us a little bit more, explaining PTSD, depression, and survivor's guilt, all these normal trauma responses?
Sure. I want to mention about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, It is an actual diagnosis that is given like any other medical diagnosis, and it has diagnostic criteria. It actually cannot be diagnosed until at least a month has passed after the traumatic event. So I want to mention that term is often overused. And so I tend to focus on trauma responses, because not everyone who develops or who has experienced a trauma will develop PTSD, but it is very common for people to experience trauma responses that may not fall under the diagnostic criteria of PTSD. But people who have experienced a trauma in the immediate sense, there is an impact, and you indicated, even Sherry, about that was explained to you about different parts of the brain. When we have experienced a severe trauma, victimized by a severe trauma, our brain functions differently. It often functions in a more primitive way. So if you are working on your church safety team and there has been an incident and people are impacted by that, one of the things that's important to know is that that person may not be functioning cognitively as you're accustomed to them functioning. So it might be necessary to speak more simply, give simple instructions, things like that. So that might be an impact right away, in addition to shock, strong emotional reactions. People may be crying. People may also be very numb. They might just seem like they're kind of shut down. They might be numb. They might not seem to be experiencing much emotion at all, because while there are certain commonalities, it is an individual process. So there are things that people might also experience: panic. Even though right at the moment they might be in a safe place, they may not feel that way, and they might feel panicked. They might experience panic attacks. They might be trying to get out of that environment. They might experience fears. For example, if there has been an attacker of some sort, and that attacker has been neutralized, he's no longer a threat, they might be afraid. I'm afraid to go home. What if he's there? Even though, so that fear might not be based in reality, but again, we're functioning in a different way at that point. So, trauma responses that might occur at the very beginning tend to be of that sort. And then as time goes on, you get away from kind of the more extreme, but you might also have things like, as I mentioned, the intrusive thoughts, sleep disturbance, flashbacks, meaning feeling like it is occurring again. In addition to the emotion, feeling very sad, crying, emotions, whatever they are, maybe being very much on the surface. Even if you are feeling good at the moment, that might be very much on the surface. Whatever that emotion is, if it's irritation, again, right there on the surface, just kind of waiting for a little window to open, and out it flies.
Thank you. That's helpful for teams to understand. But I'm going to pivot now and talk more about prevention, because this attack was triggered primarily by domestic abuse. In 2025, the Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center conducted a case study based on this incident at Sutherland Springs. And it was on the link between domestic violence and mass attacks. They included a 5-year study of 173 mass attacks. And of that 5-year study, 41% of the attackers had a history of domestic violence. This lines up with the FBSN's Deadly Force Incident Study, which I lead, and I always share with audiences domestic violence whenever we're talking about the deadly force incident study, because the statistics show that this has historically been and continues to be the deadliest threat to houses of worship. So, in the study by the National Threat Assessment Center, they lay out a timeline of this attacker and his history of violence in relationships, sexual assault, and harassment. There are victim reports, criminal reports, starting when the perpetrator was in high school. This incident was not a failure of victims or the family of victims not speaking up. Many times you can point to, well, nobody said anything. There are so many incidences in this case where his victims spoke up, they collected evidence, they shared it. This was a failure of our legal system and the all too familiar case of not holding criminals accountable for their repeated offenses. Domestic violence is not a private issue. It is the most consistent precursor to deadly church violence. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to turn to you, Sherry. This killer's wife, you knew her and her family attended your church. Tell us
Yes.
a little bit about that. How well did you know her?
I saw her grow up. She was at my house several times. She was in youth group with my own kids. She was part of our family at church. Her grandmother was actually who my daughter Annabelle was staying with that weekend of the shooting. So we were a close church family. So it wasn't like a big church where you didn't know the name of anybody and their brothers and sisters and grandmas. We were very, very close family.
Yeah, and her family was concerned about her. It was not unknown that he had her isolated.
Hmm.
When their baby was born, their second
Hmm.
child, he had threatened that grandma. And this
Hmm.
grandma that was watching your Annabelle, she was also killed in the attack, correct?
Yes. Yes.
So he had
Hmm.
threatened the grandmother and the mother when they were on their way to the hospital to see this baby.
Yes.
And just prior to the attack, it was October 31st. The family had a
Hmm.
little bit of hope because he showed up at a fall festival. This was actually, I believe, the first time his family had seen this child that was now almost 6 months old. Can you about that a little bit?
Well, I was out of town, but that was something that Lou and Carla and I talked about on the phone after the fall festival. The fall festival was always my big thing at church, and this was the first year I had ever missed it. So bright and early, November the 1st, we all talked about Lou and I had and Michelle actually, Danielle's mom, had a group text, and that was one of the things that we were talking about as friends on there, was that Danielle and the babies were at the fall festival along with their dad, the shooter. And that was amazing to those three that were there, and they were telling me about it, that he seemed normal, he seemed kind, he seemed like none of the other stuff had ever happened. He was just letting them see the baby, which was uncharacteristic, and they were hoping for fences to be mended.
And we're gonna see that sometimes that sudden niceness can be a red flag too. But I can see how it would give people so much hope. I mean, in his wife's testimony afterwards, she talked about loving this church, loving spending time at the church, taking care of the children there, and that for her, this was a safe place, which could be part of why he
Absolutely.
that. So,
Yes.
Chris,
Mhm.
I want to talk to you about this attack growing out of domestic violence and why that connection is often overlooked.
Largely because it's something that we don't see from the outside. Now, in this case, this individual had a history. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. The folks there may not have been aware of it. Very often, the domestic violence occurs just within the home, and those outside don't see because those within the home don't let on. Everything looks fine. It often doesn't start out that way. Very often we see domestic violence occurring in a cycle. There's been a lot of research done, and that research has yielded information on patterns that often occur. It starts out possibly that there are no indicators. And we'll use again the man and woman, because that's usually what happens. The man may appear very charming. There is no indication. Now, in this case, there were indications that went way back, but if someone's not aware of this individual's history, they may not know. The person can start out as being very charming, loving. The relationship seems wonderful. Often you'll hear that once the couple are married, there is increasing control that the man takes. It tends to isolate the woman. Maybe, well, now we're married. You don't need to have so much contact with family and friends. He can become more controlling, begin to exercise and control over and restrict maybe her access to financial resources that further limits her. He becomes perhaps more emotionally abusive, intimidating. And at times there may be incidents of physical abuse. And then whenever that happens, though, what they call the honeymoon phase then ensues. Oh, I'm so sorry. It will never happen again. I love you. And they make up and it starts all over. But in time, this cycle escalates, and the amount of control and intimidation and abuse begins to increase. And it's often common that someone becomes desensitized to a certain extent of what's going on. Well, this just happens and he doesn't mean it, and and is not as concerned maybe as you'd think that person might be, because they've become again more desensitized to it. It can escalate from there to increasing physical abuse. What they have found is that when there is pregnancy involved, the man being abusive to the woman when she's pregnant is also an indication of more abuse down the road. And so that's how it can escalate over time to the point where the abuse can become more and more severe. Maybe it's not public, maybe nobody else sees it, maybe the family sees it and no one else, but often it's not public. Sometimes it does escalate, though, to the point of being public.
Yeah. So why is domestic violence one of the strongest predictors of targeted violence?
Well, I think when we have other forms of violence, let's say someone has an issue with, maybe it's Christians or a particular ethnic group, then anyone that falls into that category could potentially be a target. They've got quite a wide variety of folks that they could go after, institutions, etc. With domestic violence, that person's issue is with that individual and anyone that he might view to be involved or contributing to the issue that he has with her that might limit his control over her, which could then include family, could include, in this case, let's say, her support system in church, referred to it as her safe place. And so he went in there targeting these people for a specific reason. He didn't go to another church down the street. He went to this church specifically for this reason. So there is a much narrower focus on who that attacker might decide to target.
Right. And in this case, like we said, this was a failure of a lot of people in government, Air Force, the legal system not holding him accountable. Um, so it wasn't from lack of trying for the family and the victims. But sometimes that is the case. And so some of the things that the church can do, because there's not many security team members can influence the legal system uh, like that, but there are things that we can do by paying attention to warning signs and escalating behaviors. You as a security team member, keep a ministry mindset so that you're approachable, so that you know the people in your church, so that you have that trusting relationship with pastors and counselors within your church, um, so that you know the struggling families, orders of protection, custody disputes, those with a history of domestic violence. This can be an issue when we're talking about clergy penitent privilege, or the same confidentiality principles that apply to counselors or psychologists. So, can you speak on ways to handle that, Chris?
Yeah. The laws obviously are different from state to state, jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but in general, most clergy, staff, and even security team members may need to be involved in some sort of a background check. In our church, we have something called Safe Sanctuary, and all staff and anyone that's working with children and all security team members are required to go through Safe Sanctuary training, which involves a background check. It also then makes us mandated reporters. If we believe that someone is in imminent danger of harm, whether it be a child, an elderly person, or someone who cannot otherwise take care of themselves, we are mandated reporters for that. But when it comes to people talking about their difficulties and their concerns about confidentiality, it is important for all of these folks, staff, security team, to address this as discreetly as they possibly can. Be careful what they say to whom and what information they do share, kind of on a need to know. If it's simply ask permission. Jane, is it all right with you if I speak with so and so about your concerns, or that we bring so and so in to our meeting, so and so from the security team, the head of the security team, and talk about this? And that is the most effective way, truly, to deal with confidentiality concerns, and also to foster trust with the individual who might be going through those things. So that can be very helpful. It's so important that communication gets made. Sometimes things are overlooked, and I'll jump on the survivor guilt issue right here because I did miss it previously. That can even go to people who have been traumatized, but also, let's say there are folks on the security team or maybe church staff who were not harmed, let's say, in this incident, and they may struggle with the coulda, woulda, shouldas. So anyone who is aware of trauma that has taken place, has viewed it, knows people who have been victimized by it, and I'm sure even in the situation like Sherry, everything that you went through and so many people at your church, so it is normal for us to ask, and even people who are grieving, to ask, is there something else I should have done, shoulda, woulda, coulda, and work through that as well. But exercising those good channels of communication, and above all, fostering those good relationships with the people in our church can help them feel more comfortable trusting the staff, trusting someone on the security team to share information, to be more open.
Yeah, that's great. Asking permission whenever we're having these conversations, and then to be that approachable person on the team. So you touched on something else about, you mentioned background checks. So I'm going to put this in here because this is an interesting thing that I saw that does apply to security teams. And we've just done a whole series on choosing the right people for security team. The perpetrator here, after his military career, he regularly found jobs in security roles. So screen your people well, know who you're working with. Some people like this, they're going to be drawn to those positions. So that's something else that we need to be mindful of.
Yes. Yes. And that can also go to the issue of altered worldview and the idea of, I am going to get involved and I am going to have an active role. But if it's not a healthy perspective on how can I have a role, how can I serve, then it can lead to misuse of that authority and using that authority as a way to exert control in an inappropriate way.
Yeah. Some other takeaways for the security team is to take all these warning signs from potential victims seriously, even if they're imperfect. The abuser will often come across as the one in control. So even if it is imperfect, take it seriously. Red flags are control, isolation, stalking is a huge red flag, and sudden niceness, as Sherry touched on earlier. Security is not just an armed response, it's really information flow. So I'm going to close us out talking about the relationship between survivors and the security team. And Sherry, this is something that surprises people in our world of church security, but you actually pushed back against increased security. Why is that?
Mostly because I'm a rebel, but um, uh, I think we touched on earlier about your whole world is turned upside down and you may not feel safe. I was so comfortable, so content that we lived in such a rural area. We didn't even always take our keys in with us from the car. They may stay in the console of the car when we went in. That's how lax of a community we lived in. We felt free, we felt safe at the church. And my world was turned upside down about that. I suddenly had people telling me that I wasn't safe anymore. And I didn't want to feel that way, but everybody around me was responding tactically. And I wanted to hold on to my safety net, my security, my sanctuary. I wanted to hold on to that. And it was not the right response. It was not logical because we were not safe anymore. So we had to make quite a few adjustments. They put cameras at that time. I was working in the church office and they put cameras in there. And that really incensed me because at that time I was not back. I was not through being angry with God, and everything everybody did irritated me, as Doctor said a while ago. That's just right there waiting to come out. So yes, I was very angry that they were going to be having cameras on us virtually 24/7. And then one day I stopped long enough to hear from God, and he told me, Sherry, you go to the mall, you go to the movies, and there are security guards there watching you to take care of you. Why are you kicking against the goad at these people that love you? Those security guards at the mall and the movie theater, they don't even know you, and you trust them to protect you. These people are here volunteering their time because they care about you. Stop fighting this. And I had to surrender to that and realize how wrong I had been. And I use that a lot at our talks because a lot of people feel that safety is not or the protocols are not important, or you shouldn't have a safety team because if you pray enough that you will be safe. Just like we talked about the broken leg, you are still called to protect yourself and your congregation.
That's so important for teams to hear, just so that they can remember why, one of the many reasons why it's important to be discreet and to keep that ministry mindset and their security, and not just be all about the tactics and the overbearing presence. So, Chris, how can we as security team members and church leaders recognize and respond to trauma?
Well, we've talked today about a number of the kinds of things people might experience. First of all, those relationships, making it a point to develop good relationships with the people that we have, and as you pointed out, being approachable. So that is absolutely the first step, laying that foundation. When trauma has occurred more recently, there is an incident, and it may not even seem like it's a big incident that happens at your church. Everyone's an individual, and one person could be impacted very strongly. Providing a safe place, providing that emotional support does wonders for what we need to do, helping them feel safe, in that moment, helping them get the resources that they need. And it's important for us to be aware of the resources that we have in our communities. If it's a situation where we expect possibly this is something that someone's been through something and it's now backing up on them over time, simply being a friend to that person, again, being approachable, asking them how they're doing, and responding to whatever it is that they need. It's so much depends on the individual situation, but it all comes down to fostering that relationship, being there for that person, being willing and able to help in whatever way that person needs.
Thank you. Thank you both for joining us. And I just want to say the lessons learned from this discussion today are incredibly valuable, but they came at such a cost. About Revelation 12:11, they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Shanna Honeycutt with the Faith-Based Security Network. Here at the FBSN, we're working hard to bring church leaders and security members the most relevant, real-world information possible. If you find value in what we're sharing, please help us out by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who serve their church. And if you serve your church in a ministry or security capacity, we would love to have you join us. We would like to invite you to get connected. Go to fbsnamerica.com, and together we can help keep ministries across the United States safer in a time of rising hostility toward the church. Thank you for what you do. What you've just heard matters, not just as a story of tragedy, but as a reminder that trauma does not end when the headlines fade, and that churches carry a sacred responsibility to recognize it, respond to it, and care for their people well. That's why we want to invite you to the Security Operations Summit, where church security isn't treated as just tactics and tools, but as people, hearts, and souls. Before the summit even begins, we're offering a powerful pre-event class that Dr. Priscilla Chris Clancy is teaching, from recognition to response, practical mental health skills for church security teams. This session is designed specifically for church safety and security teams, helping you recognize trauma, understand stress responses, and respond in ways that protect life and preserve dignity. If this conversation stirs something in you, don't ignore it. Equip yourself, strengthen your team, care for your church more fully. Join us at the Security Operations Summit and take the next step from awareness to action.